Basic subject in Torah thinking and practice is the subject of the relationship between a teacher and a student, Rebbe and Talmid. The dynamic that exists between a Torah teacher and a student. We've been talking about free will in the last few weeks. We've been talking about, we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu and Moses as the teacher of the Jewish people, and about the level of his free will, the fact that we said, if you remember, that the Meshech Chochmah says he rose to a level where he lost his free will. He says the same about his student, his Talmid Yehoshua. The classic paradigm, if you like, of Rebbe and Talmid is set up as that between Moses and Joshua. Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua, his Talmid, that relationship is really the archetype of a teacher-student relationship, and it's axiomatic in Torah that you can't grow without that. That means I'm trying to see how much we can manage this evening to demonstrate that the relationship between Rebbe and Talmid is an essential one. It's as essential as having a parent. Just like you can't be in the world, you can't be an independent being in the world unless there is a parent, parents who bring you into being, so too you can't be a Torah persona in the world without having been born and nurtured, as it were, by a teacher. And try to see that the relationship between a Rebbe and his Talmid is similar to that between a father and son, a parent and child, and also the marital relationship. There are fascinating parallels between a Torah teacher and his student, between Rebbe and Talmid, and partners to a marriage. So this is perhaps one of the most intimate relationships that are possible in the world, and it is essentially formative. Just like in a marriage relationship, the result of the marriage is something that transcends the two people involved, namely their own relationship, which is transcendent. The child that they form, the children that they form, which is again something beyond either or both of the parents. Similarly, the Torah that comes out of a relationship between a Rebbe and Talmid is something greater than the sum of the parts, and it has many fascinating aspects, such as the fact that the giver, which is the teacher, the Rebbe, by giving to a Talmid, actually paradoxically receives himself, right? His own growth really is very often that which comes out of his attachment to his Talmid. So let's try to feel this through, because it has some fascinating elements. And the main reason we want to study this subject is because anyone who is serious about growth in Torah knows that it's fundamental, must know that it's fundamental to have a Torah teacher. And the characteristics of the teacher, there are some remarkable features that are necessary in a person who will be one's unique teacher. For example, let's try and go through a few of the issues in no particular order, of the requirements for the greatness of a person who could qualify, let's say, to be your Rebbe. Right? You'll see that there are a number of difficulties and paradoxes here. One of them is that the purpose of a Rebbe, right? Let's try and go immediately to the depth here. The purpose of having a Rebbe is, why you want a teacher is because you want to develop your das. Das means your own inner wisdom, your own inner understanding. That means we're not talking about gaining knowledge. If it were knowledge, you could read books. That's not the purpose of a Rebbe, right? Just like the purpose of Talmud, of Gemara, is not to gain the halachic conclusions. That's not the main goal. You could reach the halachic conclusions by reading digests of halachic conclusions. You could read the Code of Jewish Law and conclude, get to the end points of how you do things. That's not the point. The reason you learn Talmud, the reason that you sweat blood over Talmud, over Gemara, is because it's in the exercise of coming to understand it that you are built. In other words, we don't want to make you a repository of Torah knowledge, of information. We want to make you a creator of Torah. The mind is what needs to be developed, not a library of facts. Right? And the main what one is looking for in the relationship with the Rebbe, development of the inner being. We're not talking about somebody who can teach you the facts. That obviously is part of the whole interaction, but that's not the purpose. The purpose here is the relationship itself, because in the relationship itself there's an expansion of the awareness, of the consciousness of the Talmud. Now, one of the problems here, just to show you how, just to begin with, hopefully this will indicate a beginning of depth of the subject, is this. In order to grow in Torah, you ask your Rebbe, right? You ask your Rebbe to be assured that you have objectivity, for example. How can you guarantee your own objectivity? Almost by definition, your own opinions cannot be objective. What you want is objectivity, right? In other words, a person who is, by definition, anyone who's not you is by definition, from one particular perspective, more objective than you are, because they're not seeing the world from within you. And by definition, a Rebbe is somebody who's reached a level of maturity, which in Torah terms means objectivity. What we're looking for in Torah study is objectivity. We're looking not to be subjectively, to look at the world through your own inner negias, in other words, vested interests, but to be able to transcend those and see the world objectively. The first job, as it were, the first benefit you have from a Rebbe is the fact that he is a definition. He's your definition, is your touchstone, your yardstick of objectivity. Right? That's the first thing. So what you're looking for is to develop, that he should develop you. I'm going to speak in the male here. Obviously, it's the same. A woman obviously needs also, yes, she also needs relationship with a persona or personality who can extend her and teach her. Many of the same issues apply. There are some unique features here, but I'm going to limit it to this one dimension this evening. Believe me, we have enough to talk about here. But this issue is, so you need certain criteria, right? The first thing you have to do, obviously, is choose a Rebbe. Huh? You have to choose the person who will be your teacher. The problem is, that is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. And all important decisions, by definition, you run through the consciousness and opinion of your Rebbe. Can you see the problem? So when you go out to choose a Rebbe, it's a one life-changing decision that you can't ask your teacher. You can't ask your Rebbe because you're here choosing him. Which means, paradoxically, you have to start the process with your own dais. It's a remarkable thing. It's a very lonely place to be. That means here you're choosing somebody who's going to be your teacher, and yet you can't really, all you can rely on is your own inner intuition, your own sense of the connection you will have with that person, and you have to apply some basic criteria of, so we have some basic criteria. Obviously common sense is required. You need somebody who by definition knows more than you, somebody who by definition you can see has reached a level of self-control, a certain degree of objectivity, a certain mastery. A person you can see will relate to you with fearlessness, will be prepared to tell you what's wrong with you fearlessly, is not going to be caught up in the dynamic in such a way that it will change his objectivity. Obviously these are, and one makes mistakes. Once you have an immature dais and you make such a move, you can see later there could be a mistake. Incidentally, this problem doesn't obviate, right? Doesn't obviate the obligation to choose a Rebbe. It's halacha. That's actually a Torah binding obligation. Aseh lecha rav. The Mishnah says, Aseh lecha rav. Make for yourself a teacher. You have to do it, right? It's a facet of Torah that you have to go and do. It's to make someone your teacher. So what happens if you find difficulty choosing? What happens if there's no one available? What happens if there's no one available that is so impressive that you can feel that you could negate your own dais, your own opinion in the face of his? What do you do there? I mean, obviously there's some practical steps. One of the practical steps that many people growing in this area find is that they begin by taking on more than one person. For example, you might have a range of people who you respect in different areas, and maybe one person you can see is adequate halachically. You can bounce off your halachic queries of such a person. There could be somebody else who's very skilled from a personal counseling point of view. That means you can speak to this individual, shows you your own, helps you develop your own insight and objectivity. That could be, somebody else could be, let's say, a good advisor. Many people will tell you, especially in the Baal Tshuva world, as they grow in this process, they take on more than one individual because no one person is big enough, could be, to cover all the bases. It's a tremendous privilege, and it can take years to merit that privilege, to come across somebody who's big enough that ab initio, that means your starting point is that this person is big enough that even if he says black when it looks white to me, there's a very good probability it will turn out black. So we have many interesting laws. One is, you see, the second paradox, let me try and mention it clearly also at the outset, is that the real, please stay with me carefully here, the real Rebbe that you want, right, what you're looking for here in most depth, is somebody who teaches you to be independent, even though what you are looking for is a person who will teach you and show you. But paradoxically, what you're looking for is somebody who will make you independent, at least at your previous level. Again, to take a simple analogy, if you want someone to teach you a sport, a coach to teach you a particular skill in athletics or sport, you don't want the kind of person who will make you a master while he holds your hand. You want the kind of person who may hold your hand in the beginning, but will ultimately bring you to a point where you will be independent of him, right? Paradoxically, what you want is to outgrow, as it were, that. Of course, you never outgrow the relationship, because as you reach a deeper level of maturity, you understand that there's more depth to him than you were able to perceive before. And thereby you find him holding your hand at a new level of maturity. But there's no question that at the previous level of maturity that you've now surpassed, you should be independent. In other words, the definition of a Rebbe is somebody who will help you develop your own das, not his. In other words, who will make you independent. Perhaps one of the most beautiful ways to say it is this. The Mishnah says, He'emidu talmidim harbe, which means, loosely translated, on the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says that the men of the Great Assembly, who were our teachers, who were the teachers of the beginning of the process of the oral law in a certain sense, they said three things. One of the things they said was, He'emidu talmidim harbe, which has many nuances and subtleties in that expression. But the simplest translation perhaps would be raise many disciples. Teach many students. Raise many disciples. But what you can't say in English, and the Hebrew is so resonates with this meaning, is the Hebrew word he'emidu, means stand up. It means raise, literally stand up many disciples. And the nuance to hear here is that it means stand them on their feet, not yours. He'emidu means put them on their feet. The definition of an invalid guru, not a deep, genuine guru, but an invalid guru, is a person who makes his students dependent on him. And the definition of a Rebbe is somebody who makes his students independent of him. Is this point clear? And therefore, the hallmark of a cultish devotion is where the leader lives only through the adherence of his subjects. That is all he is. And the subjects live only in the personality and the character of the cult leader. That is exactly what you're not looking for. You're looking for adherence and a tight relationship and interdependent bond between them, but in such a way that he doesn't need you. If you find a teacher who needs you to be his protege and disciple, there's something wrong with him. That the hallmark of a Jewish leader is that he doesn't want to be a leader. Read, for example, the arguments Moshe Rabbeinu gave to Hashem when he was chosen to lead the Jewish people. The hallmark of a Jewish leader is one who tries to get out of the task because he doesn't see himself as being equal to the task, and there are exceptions. You have to know. You have to know where they apply. Who became the leaders of the Jewish people? Moshe Rabbeinu tried to argue his way out of it until Hashem forced him into it. And the elders of the people who were chosen to be the taskmasters over their own people. Why did they merit to be great leaders later? Because instead of beating their Jewish subjects, they took the beatings themselves. So in case you're looking here for Jewish leadership, these are the beginning, if you'd like to be a Jewish leader, these are the beginning. First of all, you must not want it. You must want not to have it, and if someone tries to give it to you, you have a very convincing argument why you don't want it. And secondly, you have to take the beatings that will be dished out to your underlings in their place. That's the beginning of the criteria for responsibility. There are exceptions, obviously, and there are unique times and places that require other conducts, and there's a broad discussion. And then what you want is that the people who'll be as it were, dependent on you, you're able to make them independent. Does a parent want his child to be utterly and permanently, eternally dependent on him? No. What he seeks is a permanent relationship with the child. But the real way to achieve an ongoing, meaningful relationship with the child is to make the child independent. On the contrary, the way to destroy a relationship with your own child is to make him so utterly dependent on you that never flexes his muscles or spreads his wings, and he always needs you. No. The right way is to give him the freedom. But it should be done in such a mature fashion that the child realizes that his freedom and his maturity came from the nurturing. Is this point clear? And therefore they said, Miru talmidim harbe. They said, stand up many disciples. Don't stand them on your feet, stand them on theirs. Right? That's the first point. The second point is, can you hear the paradox here? You're looking for a person who's going to develop your own das and make you independent of him. And yet before you can even begin the process, you have to be able to define that for yourself. There's a very clear message here that the beginning of growth here is you have to find your own resources. And the end product of finding a Rebbe will be that he'll help you enhance and develop your own resources in the end. The Rambam says, Asay lecha Rav, you have to make yourself a teacher. The Rambam learns like this. Asay lecha Rav means you have to make yourself a teacher. What happens if you can't find somebody big enough? Then you still have to do it. How do you do it? You find somebody who's better than you. Who's better than you. He may not be the best. He may not be the biggest. He may not be your dream in terms of perfection, but he's one step ahead of you. That's good enough for now. You may see that he's not perfect and there's certain deficiencies. That doesn't alter the... You have to be practical. Sometimes a second-year chemistry student may be a more competent teacher of the first-year chemistry student than the professor. The professor may be out of touch with what it means to teach the first-year student. The second-year student may be, you've just been through the course himself. He may be adequate for that purpose. He may be adequate. The Rambam does say if you can't find somebody adequate even for that, then you have to teach yourself. You have to teach yourself. Then you become your own teacher. Right? You have to be your own teacher. In fact, one of the inherent paradoxes here is that the Judaism began with a man who was his own teacher. Avram Avinu became a person. The Gemara says, the Midrash in the Gemara says, Nasu kil Yosav Rabban. His kidneys became his teachers. Or another place it says he became his own teacher. Since he didn't have a Rebbe, he broke away. He stood against the whole world. The world was all on one side. He was on the other. There was no one to be his teacher. Everybody in the world was already predicating their whole process on the wrong basis. There was no one to be his teacher. He had to carve out for himself his own identity, and his kidneys became his teachers. Why kidneys is a deep mystical subject, and that's not for now. But for now, let's just say that the kidneys are beneath consciousness. They're very, very deep. From the kidneys comes out what's called Eitzah. Klas yoatzois. It means the kidneys give Eitzah. Eitzah means practical knowledge of what to do, even when the intellect can't grasp why. Okay, everybody has such a deep level. It's a very, very deep intuition. It also needs. But he began as his own teacher. And Rav Simcha Wasserman used to say that the last generation in the world's history will be just like him, will have to do it without teachers. We'll finally get to such a devolved position, such a broken down position in human history, that there won't be left anymore teachers that we'll be able to look up to. It's such a fragmented and such a broken down situation that will ultimately be left. The Gemara says before the Mashiach comes, emes nederes, which is, I mean, literally it means the truth has disappeared. But of course, the Gemara learns it means Adorim, Na says Adorim, that the truth will be like little flocks of sheep in the desert. You'd have to go and who knows where and how far to find little pockets of truth. Right? Finding genuine access is a very, very difficult process. Right? And somebody who's offering to be your teacher and claiming that he knows is the first place to avoid. Now that's the first place to. Somebody setting himself up. I was once present in the presence of a great man who was talking about the subject. And one of the students said to him, "But how do you become a teacher? How do you become a teacher? How do you become an effective teacher?" He said to him, "You develop yourself. You develop yourself, and one day you'll be driving your cart down the road. You'll look back and you'll find a few hapless individuals have attached themselves to your cart. Never, yes, and they're now attached to you. They call you you are now their Rebbe. You never looked for that. You're driving your own cart. You're trying to go someplace. But sooner or later, if you manage to drive your own cart well enough, and you become anything basically, you'll find people who even less, even though you consider yourself, and you're probably right, to be nothing, but you're probably less of a nothing, if you know what I mean, than some others who probably think they're actually more of a something at that stage, but it doesn't matter. And ultimately, some of those will be attached to your own cart, and you become a teacher, right? Not because you... Yeah. So, this is the beginning of the process. This is the beginning of the process. Now, of course, the next step is this, that the teacher's characteristic is somebody who's looking... That means when he wants to be a teacher, a Torah teacher, when he put in that role, let's say, what is the characteristic of such an individual? So there's an amazing thing here, and that is that you have to understand, it's a subtle point, very deep and a beautiful point, is that the desire to be a teacher, that means to be full of Torah, and to want others to enjoy it, right? Which you often find, you see a burning desire for that very often you see it in the Baal Tshuva world. People who had nothing and discovered Torah relatively late in their lives. And the characteristic of such people is that they're very enthusiastic about it, right? Very enthusiastic about it. The well-known duality here is that people who grow up in the religious mode, people who grow up from knowing a lot of Torah, so the advantage they have is that they know a lot. The disadvantage they have is they're often not that enthusiastic. Often not that enthusiastic because there's a certain element of habit. And the people who grew up in the non-frum world, the people who grew up without the privilege of a Torah background, the disadvantage they often have is that they don't know much. They don't know much. They get caught up to the Torah, they don't know how to say the words, you give them a bench, they hold it upside down. It's humiliating. They don't know much. On the other hand, they're often very enthusiastic. they're often very enthusiastic. If you want my opinion, I think it could be a better asset than knowing a lot and not being enthusiastic. To be on the first rung of the ladder heading up is probably a better position than to be on the top rung of the ladder sort of sliding down. Right? And therefore, you often find this enthusiasm. Now, what is the real hallmark of a genuine teacher? And the hallmark of a genuine teacher is that he's giving over, not what he has to give over, but what the student needs to receive. It's a remarkable thing, this, an amazing thing. Let me try and put it to you this way. I learned this in the most beautiful way from a teacher of mine, a very great teacher of Simcha Wasserman, who was one of the leaders of the previous generation, the son of regrettable Chanan Wasserman, who was a student of the Chofetz Chaim, star pupil of the Chofetz Chaim. And I had the privilege to know him, and I got to know him well. Our families were related, and my brother-in-law turned out to be his physician, and there were many points of contact, privilege to the last couple of decades of his life which he spent in Yerushalayim, so we privileged to have a lot of contact. And the experience of being close to somebody in his 80s and 90s from the previous generation of indescribable greatness. Right? I mean, I personally saw him do with my own eyes things that were impossible. I personally witnessed incidents. Tonight's not the time to talk about it. I'm sure you're not interested in those things. But there were... I personally witnessed experiences that were remarkable. And it's time perhaps I'll tell you about those on another occasion. But the point is that I learned a remarkable thing from him. He used to explain as follows. It says about a Torah teacher, in fact, an interesting discussion in the Talmud, which deals with the subject, that the way it's put is like this. More than the calf wants to drink, the cow wants to nurse. More than the calf wants to suckle, more than the calf wants to drink milk from its mother, the cow wishes to nurse, to give milk. The wrong understanding of that, which is exactly understood wrongly by those people who have this particular mode, those who most need to understand it correctly, of course, is that more than the calf is thirsty, it's a biological problem, right? The calf is thirsty, needs to drink. The cow is heavy with milk. If a cow doesn't give her milk, it becomes painful, right? It becomes painful. Even sometimes milk needs to be extracted, even if there isn't a calf, because it causes pain, and it's the cow can be overloaded with milk. It's a cruelty not to milk such a cow. So biologically, more than the calf needs to drink because of its hunger, the mother animal, the cow, has milk to offload because she has milk to offload. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. The correct understanding is the cow wants to give her milk, not because she's heavy with milk, but because she wants the calf to drink. There's a world of difference between wanting to give because you wanting to give, and wanting to give because the receiver needs to receive. Right? In the memorable analogy of the Chavis Alvavos, the difference is that when milk is given correctly, the breast gives the right amount of milk. When the child sucks more milk is produced. When the child suckles less milk is produced. And the reason is, if there would be a set amount, if the child need more, it would be inadequate. And if the child needed less, it might be stifled by too much flow of milk. Therefore, the breast is that organ that adjusts how much it gives according to the need of the receiver. And that's why that analogy is used. The teacher is one who's giving what the student needs, not what he has to give. Sometimes the talent of the teacher is not to give, because the student's not ready. The immature teacher is wanting to give off his load, even to impress maybe. Maybe he's motivated for the benefit of his student, but he's not looking what the student needs now. Sometimes a great teacher will... I was once sitting in a class where Rav Simcha was teaching. He's just as a hallmark of this. He used to teach in Ohr Somayach in Jerusalem. He insisted on teaching the beginners. It was a remarkable thing to see. Here you're talking about a man in his 80s, one of the giants of the previous generation. His mastery in Torah knowledge was breathtaking. And he would come into the yeshiva and not take an advanced class. He would teach those who had no exposure at all. So you had this phenomenon, you have this great man sitting in a room, and the people he was teaching were people who walked in off the street that day. That people who had been tourists at the Western Wall, and somebody had walked over to them and said, "Are you Jewish?" And they more or less vaguely acknowledged that they sort of thought they were Jewish. And the next thing they knew, they found themselves sitting in a shir in Ohr Somayach, listening to Rav Simcha Wasserman. That an incredible disparity, listening to a person that he couldn't begin to appreciate. Understand what his knowledge means at all. That's whom he would teach. So on one occasion he was sitting there in the lecture, and of course a lot of us who considered ourselves to have more background than those beginners would sneak in, because this is an opportunity of a lifetime. Once I was sitting in such a class, and a young fellow who'd been there for a day Right? He'd been in Ohr Somayach, he'd been in the yeshiva for one day. He asked a certain question. And it was one of those questions which is what you dream of getting as a teacher. Because one of those questions, and this young man asked the question aggressively and in an improper fashion without due respect. He didn't know who he was. He was new, he didn't understand. He had an inflated image of his own knowledge, and he didn't know. And it's one of those questions that you relish, because it's one of those questions that when somebody asks you that, you can plaster the walls thinly with this individual. You can dismember him in delicious, delicate pieces. And so, I held my breath, because this was going to be... And Simcha, I'll never forget this, he had the most amazing blue eyes. And he looked long and hard at the student, and then he said to him in a very interesting voice, he said, "You're not ready for the answer to that question." And then he carried on with the lecture, and the young man sat there taken aback, and the lecture continued. After the lecture, after the show, I went out, and I said, Rav Wasserman, why didn't the Rav answer him thus and thus? And I said the answer. I mean, why didn't you say that? There's an answer like that available. And Simcha said to me, he looked at me with those same blue eyes. And he said this, he said, because if I would have answered him that answer, what would he have said next? And I had to admit that I could very well predict what the next step would have been. He said, and then what would I have said? And he walked me through the steps, inevitable steps that the discussion, and showed me that it would have ended up as a disaster. So he said, I had to make the decision whether it was better to give him the unsatisfactory situation of not answering him, or giving him an answer that I knew would, and therefore it was better for him to feel unanswered at that point than to have, do you understand that? Amazing thing. And you know what happened to that young man? He spent 3 weeks, after 3 weeks in the yeshiva, it was my lot to learn with him, and 3 weeks later he was a totally different person, and 3 weeks later he asked me that question, and I plastered the walls with it, right? In thin, delicate slices, because he was ready. He was ready. He was ready at that point, and he went on to develop very, very beautifully. But you see, the point is, you're not ready for the answer to that. You see, so I learned that the hallmark of the teacher was he's not teaching what he knows. He's teaching what the student needs. When he was nifter, when he died at the age of 91 or 92, I was present. I happened to be in South Africa at the time, and there was he didn't explicitly, he made it clear, didn't want any hespedim, any eulogies, but we got together, the community got together. And I'll never forget the experience of the Rosh Yeshiva reading out his tzavor, his will, his own personal will that he had written, right? And I'll never forget what it said. He wrote as follows. He said, when I am nifter, when I die, I permit no hespedim at all. That means no one, it's a very important thing to eulogize a person who's died, to say those things that are meticulously accurate and good about the person. Tremendous spiritual benefit. It's a big thing. No one's allowed to say anything about me, except if my Rebbitzin is still alive. They never had any children of Simcha and his wife. Right? So they were everything to each other, and their children were us. We were the children, right? All our generation. But he said like this: that when I'm no longer here, no one say anything about me. If she's alive, now obviously if the Rebbitzin is alive, it would be a very public, explicit dishonor. For a person of that stature not to have a hespedim. And therefore, if she's alive, I allow it, but only under the following conditions. Only one hesped and only one maspid. You know what that means? Only one eulogy and only one person may speak, and he may only say the following. Do you imagine that? That's what he wrote. He may say the following two facts only. That means if she's alive in her honor, somebody may speak about me, but only one occasion, only one person, and he may only say the following. You see, Rosh Simcha was concerned, obviously, that it's a very, very important thing that when a person's no longer here and they say things about you, that things are true. And the reason is because when a soul is no longer in this world, but it's in what we call the Olam HaEmes, the world of truth, can you imagine the pain that soul feels when you say things that are good about the person that are not true? Can you imagine? There's an absolute and total contradiction between what's being said and who you are. In this world, if they say wonderful things about you that are not true, that's just fine. Yeah, just wonderful. The more the better. What's the problem? What's the problem? On the contrary, and you can get up and say, oh, it's not true, it's not true. And they'll say, wow, you're modest as well. And you can say, well, that's it. I once delivered a baby at 3 o'clock in the morning. I happened to be up doing I was doing some writing as it happens. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the woman in the flat, it was in Israel, she couldn't get to the baby's being delivered fast, and before the ambulance could get there, so I ran in, and I got there at exactly the right moment, and I delivered the child. So at the child's breast, the father made a speech, and he said, and we're so lucky in this place where we live to have doctors who are so righteous that they're up at 3 o'clock in the morning learning. So I get up and I said publicly, I wasn't learning. He said, and they're so modest. Can't win, you know. But imagine if you're in that world, which is a world of pure truth, and they're saying things about you that are flattering, that are not true. Can you imagine that? They're immense pain. No? So Rasim said like this, he may only say the following. Now listen carefully. I tried to teach every Talmud according to his need. And secondly, that I had the merit to play a part in the development of some people along the way. But when I heard those words, I realized that here was a man who had a goal, he had a focus. This was not a person who went through life sort of like most of us, coping, right? Whatever you can do today, you do, you can cope with this, you can achieve that. He had a goal, and his goal was totally unified. Here's a man who had a life project, and his life project was unified. That means he could state a goal, and the goal was explicitly to teach Torah according to the need of each student. What a remarkably focused. And then I realized that all the years I'd known him and all the things that I'd seen him doing, they were an explicit moving towards that goal. Now, it was not just a talent, it was a definite focus, and therefore he never said something until he once told me an interesting thing. He told me that just after the war, where he was, he had a Talmud who came to him from one of the towns in Europe, who had wanted to learn. He even told me what they learned. They learned Bechairos together, as it happens. This young man came to learn with him, and they began learning. And he said, as they started, he was a very intelligent young man, and as they started learning, Rav Simcha saw that the man, he was destroyed this thing. In his learning, he was destroyed. He said things that were very nice, but that had nothing to do with the text. He would come up with theories, and he would say logic that had nothing to do with the text at hand. Rav Simcha said, he went into the story. It turned out that this young fellow, when he first went to yeshiva in the days before the war, he was sent to one of those yeshivas where the custom was that a young fellow arriving was given an older boy to learn with. That means he would be given the privilege of a personal tutor for one of the more mature boys who would learn with him and show him the ropes and be like an older brother and older chavros. He said this young man was unfortunate enough to get an older fellow who was so full of his own knowledge and his own Torah that he was only too thrilled to impart what he knew. So he would offload all his, what Rav Simcha called his peklach, right? His parcels, as it were, of knowledge. That means they'd come across a Rashi, and it would remind him of something, and he would share with this young Talmud something very interesting and beautiful, but nothing to do with what Rashi was saying. He never trained him to learn what the words are saying. Put aside your own concept. What is being said here, right? Divest yourself of all your subjectivity and all your desire to impress and to show. And he had an intrinsic, an essential element of his own learning process destroyed by that means. And therefore we're talking here about somebody who is, by definition, I hope the picture is emerging here, a Rebbe who's reached some level of objectivity, whose interest, if he is interested in your growth, is what you need. And if it means giving you more, if it means a criticism, if it means a praise, if it means withholding a praise, if it means not teaching, then that's what he'll do. Let's take the next step. What is the methodology that he uses? There are two schools here, okay? This also needs clarification. There are two schools of teaching. You know, there's the gentle, what we call the Beis Hillel, way of Lo'elam have anvasan kehli Hillel. Always be a humble, self-effacing individual like Hillel. Or Beis Shammai. Shammai was a very kaptan, what's called kaptan. Kaptan means to be very, very exacting. No leeway, no tolerance. the way the Gemara puts it, Shammai, amas habinyan beyado. It's a very, very beautiful metaphor. Amat habinyan beyado means he held in his hand a yardstick. Amas habinyan means the cubit of a builder's cubit. a builder's yard, you'd call it. In English you call it a yardstick. He carried in his hand a measuring stick. Okay? It doesn't mean literally that he walked around with a builder's meter. But what it means, do you understand? It means that in his hand was a measure that you had to measure up to. Do you remember the famous story in the Gemara? You must remember, in Gemara Shabbos, a young man a certain individual had a bet with his friend that he could anger Hillel. Do you remember the story? He had a large bet with his friend that he could anger Hillel. First of all, he went to try it on Shammai. And Shammai beat him off with his Amasabinyan, beat him off trying to ask presumptuous questions. So he went to Hillel, who was known to be a totally self-effacing. You're talking about one of the greatest minds that ever lived, one of the greatest men who ever lived. Hillel was the very early generation of the Tanoim, well in the phase when people could revive the dead, right? Just at will. You're talking about, but total control in the self-effacement departments. So he came to Hillel and he rushed out into the place in front of Hillel's house Friday afternoon. Now that's the worst time, right? Friday afternoon is when the Satan is dancing. That's when the Yetzer Hara is really. If there are ever arguments in a marriage, right? That's Friday afternoon. It's because, sure, present company excluded, but when there is tension, it's Friday afternoon. Things are tough, right? Shabbos is approaching. There's little time left. That's when and also Shabbos should be a time of closeness to his husband and wife. And knowing that it should be is where there's the greatest temptation to get into arguments, to destroy that, which should be the most peaceful and loving day. Okay, anyway. So there's tension. Hillel's in the bath, and this man appears in front of his house and he starts yelling, "Mi kan Hillel." Yeah, who here is called Hillel? First names, yeah, no rabbis, no titles, no. Who's called? So Hillel comes out in his bathrobe and he says, "Yes, my son." Interesting that the Rebbeim call their Talmidim B'ni, my son, because there's a very intimate connection here between a teacher and his student and a father and his son, not accidental. He said, "Yes, my son." He says to him, "Why do Patagonians have wide feet?" That's what he calls him out of his bath on Friday afternoon. Hillel, you go and trouble Hillel with a life and death question. So-and-so's on a respirator, they want to switch it off. It's a life and death issue. You're going to ask a psak halacha. He comes to ask him, why the Patagonians? So Hillel says to him, because they live in an area where the sand is very soft. So the flat feet, the big wide feet, it helps him traction. Goes back to his bath. Fellow goes back. Sometime later, it's getting more tense, closer to Shabbos, comes back. "Mi kan Hillel." Hillel comes out, he says to him, "Why do the Eastern nations have slit eyes?" The Torah question, you understand? So Hillel tells him, because they live in a place of high winds and the dust would get in there. So eventually, after a number of attempts, he says to Hillel, "Would that there would be few like you among the Jewish people." Not a question anymore, direct insult. So Hillel says to him, "Why do you say that? Why should there be few like me?" He said, "Because of you I've lost a lot of money." So Hillel said to him, "It's better than you should have lost your money in your bet than I should have got angry." So and the Gemara says, if you have to rule which way you should be as a teacher, this is the way to be. You should choose the path. You choose the path of being, when it's correct and appropriate to be stepped on, to be trodden upon in a certain way without yielding kavod Torah. It's a delicate issue here. Okay, we have to discuss this. But assuming we're not talking here about the dignity of Torah, the famous example, many examples, a famous example of Akiva Tatz, for example. Yeah, last couple of 100 years, one of the genius level minds of these generations. Akiva Tatz was a completely self-effacing individual, completely self-effacing. He was traveling in a train and he came to a Jewish town and the whole population had made a whole ceremony to greet him. He kept looking around he didn't understand who was on the train that they came to. But when it came to the honor of Torah, the kavod Torah, there was no compromise at all. That means when he represented Torah leadership, and Torah leadership needed to be asserted with its power and dignity, right? There was nothing, when it needed to be assertive, he was. One example I can tell you, perhaps, is being assertive, despite being self-effacing, was an example where a man in his town needed to divorce his wife and refused. So Akiva Tatz called him in. The man came into his house, and Akiva Tatz said to him in a very soft voice, he said to him, no importuning, no remonstrating. He simply said to him, "Isha yotzeis beget u'b'misa sabal." He quoted in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says there are two ways a woman goes out of a marital relationship, either with a divorce or by death of the husband. So the man said, "No, I'm not divorcing her." So Akiva said to him again, Ha'isha yotzes beget ubemisa sabal. A woman goes out either by divorce or death of the husband. The man said, no, never. And he stormed out the house and died on the front steps. He told him, right? He told him, get to Mrs. Abad. Told him, right? But the problem is, the question is, that there are many Torah teachers who weren't like that. There are many Torah teachers who weren't self-effacing. Why does it say, always choose the path of self-effacement and humility, when we see that many teachers who weren't like that? In the last generation, for example, in Yerushalayim, say, Rav Issa Zalman Meltzer was one of those who was completely, if you said something wrong in front of him, if you expounded a Torah idea wrongly in front of him, he gently said to you, what you probably mean is, and we would rephrase your statement, even if it would be the opposite of what you said, correctly. And that's how he was. And the Briskerov, for example, was exactly the opposite. If you said something wrong in front of him, he started shaking. They had to take you out of the room before there was an explosion. Right? I mean, it was dangerous. There were these two parts. So the question is, why do some Torah teachers handle themselves with such a, you understand, that methodology? The Chacham Tzvi, for example, one of the great authorities, great halachic authorities of these generations. He conducted himself in such an absolutely royal fashion, by such a dictatorially, or the community where he served couldn't get on with him. In fact, on one occasion he actually had to leave. And the way he handled it was, he went into the house of a poor Jew. It's a true story. I actually heard this from one of his descendants. I heard this personally from one of his descendants, who said he could say it because he was a descendant. I heard it personally in public. He said he walked into the home of a poor Jew and he said, I've come to stay. Didn't ask, he said, I've come to stay. So he stayed in the house and he conducted himself in a very, very high, this Jew basically waited on him hand and foot. And after a long period of time, when it got close to breaking point, this Jew came to him and he said, Rebbe, I suppose as politely as he could, he said, how long will the Rebbe still be staying? So Chacham Tzvi said to him like this, because you asked me that question, I'm going to tell you something. Had you not asked that question, right, I would have given you a bracha ad sof kol hadoros. That means until the end of all the generations. Right? But I want you to know what's going to happen. Exactly a week's time, they're going to come to me from Vienna and offer me the rabbonos to become a rabbi in Vienna, and so that's when I'm leaving. I'm going to stay another week in your house, as I told him, and then I will leave. Had you not asked me this question, I would have given you a bracha ad sof kol hadoros. Now, because you asked that question, I'll give you a bracha. And it will last for many generations, but not necessarily ad sof kol hadoros. That man was the first Rothschild. It was his home. But that was the way of conduct. I personally have been associated, and names are not important, but I personally have had the experience of sitting of being close to a teacher. Simcha was very, very, very self-effacing, very approachable. And I've had the opposite experience. I've had the privilege to be associated and to spend time in the presence of and learning from a great man whose method is, what can I say, exacting. I've heard him say things to students that are difficult to survive, difficult to... Once in a class, a student asked a question and he said to him, that question is not even stupid. 5 minutes later, the same fellow asked another question and he said to him, oh, that's already stupid. The fellow was Israeli, so he could take it, but he was tough enough to handle it, and obviously the Rebbe had judged that he was tough enough to take it. But the problem is that they say today the metal, that means the fiber of the students, is weak, to the extent that if the Rebbe wishes to give that kind of mussar, that means that kind of discipline, that kind of demonstrating of deficiency, unfortunately today we're very soft today. Today if the Rebbe criticizes a student, he goes to look for another Rebbe. And therefore the Rebbe has to be very gentle, only because the students often can't take it. He himself once said that this option of being self-effacing as a teacher only applies to a person who has a question. That means a person whose conduct is, and his teaching effectiveness is, in being exacting, and of course he's on the standard, the level himself, then that's how he has to be. But for one who's considering which way to go, the default position that he should adopt is the one of being humble and self-effacing. But today it's uncommon to find students who who are able to take the criticism. The function of a Rebbe. The Rambam says lahachlimam. That's a remarkable thing. The Rambam says lahachlimam. The function of a teacher is that he has to. It's very harsh when you say it in English. It means to shame the student. It doesn't mean to shame him personally. Obviously, that's especially in public. But it means to show him his deficiency. That's what it means. The Rambam says that every community needs a person. Every community, the Rambam says, needs a person. I'm not making it up. I'll show you. The Rambam says that every community needs a person who can criticize them. Every community needs somebody who will. Listen to this. Lefikach tzarich lahamid b'chol kal v'kal miYisrael. It's an obligation to establish in every Jewish community Chacham Gadol, a great wise Torah personality, V'zakein, an elder, V'yoreh Shemayim min Urav, who's been God-fearing since his youth, V'ahuv lahem, beloved to them, Shemochiach l'rabim u'machziron b'tshuva. He has to rebuke the public and return them to. Why we don't do it today is not because we're not willing to do it today, but there's a dearth of people who are certainly perceived to be on that level to the extent that the community is able to take it. And the laws of learning Torah, that's in Hilchos Tshuva, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, where the Rambam talks about the laws of learning Torah, he says that there's no question that a Rebbe is permitted to demonstrate the deficiency, right? But it's not every student who can take this. Today we have a problem with self-esteem and easy to break down people's self-esteem. There's a beautiful version of this that Chidush Harim says, great Hasidic leader, lived not that long ago. He says this, a very beautiful insight. As you say in English. Somebody who walks at his Rebbe's right is an uncultivated, empty individual. The simple meaning of that statement is that when you walk with a great person, you have to walk at his left. The place of honor is the right-hand side, and therefore in walking next to somebody who deserves respect, the derech eretz, that means the Torah, for want of a better word, etiquette, is to put such an individual at your right-hand side, you walk at his left. So somebody who walks at his Rebbe's right, doesn't even know the first, never mind Torah, he doesn't even know what you'd call good manners, etiquette of decent, refined Torah conduct. And therefore, it's evidence that he's an empty fellow. Okay, that's the simple translation. Says the Chidush Harim, a very beautiful insight, characteristic. He says, "Hahoylech leyamin rabo," means somebody who walks at the Rebbe's right-hand side. You know, Kabbalistically, the right hand is always the side of chesed, of loving kindness and gentleness and giving. And the left hand is always the side of what we call gvura, which means power and the power of holding back and disciplining and limitation. He says, the one who wants to walk at his Rebbe's right hand means somebody who wants to always walk in the shadow of his Rebbe's midah, of kindness and gentleness and encouragement. You're doing fine, don't worry. He gets a caress and he gets encouragement all the time. Such a person will always be an empty fellow. Only the person who's prepared to walk at his Rebbe's left means the hand that beats down, right, and demonstrates deficiency and punishes and pounds. That's a person who will amount to something. It's a very beautiful insight. Of course, he learns it in the words. It says a person who wants to walk on his Rebbe's right, meaning relate to his Rebbe's side of kindliness. That's not what one needs. If you have a coach in a sport who always tells you you're fine, you don't need to improve, you're doing just fine and it's wonderful and you're so impressed with your performance, change your coach. Right? You want a coach who tells you that you're shocking and almost hopeless and he doesn't even know if it's worth continuing with you. You've got to be prepared, right, to take that and thereby be elevated. So those are some of the requirements. I mean, there are many countless examples. Perhaps to give you one more example, the Rogatchover Gaon. He's known as a Gaon, the genius. The Rogatchover Gaon was a very acerbic, but very, very sharp, yet a very wry and dry and acid sense of humor, right? And he was a very, very great man. Can I tell you one story about him before we get to the story I was thinking of? Can you handle that? He was once learning with the Ohr Somayach. Two of them were chavrusas. They learned together in Dvinsk. Two of the great geniuses of the first part of the century. They were learning together and they had a violent argument about the interpretation of a Tosfos, one of the classical commentaries in the Talmud. Completely
diametrically opposed views. They couldn't resolve who was right. And as they got to the high point of their argument, a certain rabbi entered the room who was from another town. It was just before Pesach. He was traveling home to his community, and he was known to have what's called a krum kop. Right? It means a crooked head. That means this individual was known to always say the opposite of what was right. It was just that was who he was. He just always got it wrong. Reliably got it wrong. So their faces both lit up when he walked in. And they said, look, here we can resolve our problem. Let's go ask him. So they both walked over to the individual and they asked him his opinion, and he said exactly like the Rogachover Gaon. Said exactly like the Gaon. So they sat down, the Ohr Somayach looked across at the Gaon and he said, no, what do you say? So the Gaon said, look, it's just before Pesach and he's very busy and he's confused. He's confused. He only said right because he's confused. Had he been thinking straight, he would have said wrong. That's a Gemara joke, okay, that's all. Anyway, the story that I wanted to share with you about the Rogachover was that we're sharing some stories about Torah teachers, right? Is that they say at the end of his life, he was in extreme pain. Extreme pain. And it was very difficult to relieve his pain. But there was one guaranteed way they could relieve his pain: speak to him in learning. You know, the power of concentration of the Torah greats was beyond any imagination. There are even stories of certain Torah leaders, more than one, in the early part of the century, who had abdominal operations without anesthesia, only asked to give enough time to get into the sugya, and they sat there and got into it. In the Hasidic version of the story, one great Hasidic leader sang. And the Hasidim still sing that tune today. It's a remarkable tune. He sang himself into a state which was physical anesthesia. And greats from a different tradition put their minds into learning. So the Rogachover's pain was relieved by people speaking to him in learning. The problem was, no one dared to speak to Rogachover in learning. No one dared to speak to him because he was so incredibly deep and sharp that you couldn't say anything that made him, that even began to make sense in his terms. So what they did was this: they got all the boys in the yeshiva to go in one after another to ask him a question. But obviously they weren't going to ask their own questions. So what they did was Rabbi Akiva Tatz, whom I mentioned before, his famous questions had just come out. They'd just been published, and the Rogachover hadn't seen them yet. Now Rabbi Akiva Tatz's questions on the Talmud are some of the most deep and amazing and perplexing questions that have ever been. Some people spend their lives trying only to begin to understand. Right? There's one, just to give you an example, one classic individual who's written a book answering all of Rabbi Akiva Tatz's questions except one. And when he took it to one of the great Torah leaders of this generation, he said, that's the only one you understood. So the questions are amazingly difficult questions, incredibly difficult questions. So what happened was, each of the boys studied and memorized one of Rabbi Akiva Tatz's questions and went in and asked the Rabbi the question as if it was his. He didn't tell him where it came from. He said, I wonder if the Rebbe could answer the following difficulty. And one after another they went in and asked the Rogachover, who was very, very sick and in tremendous pain. They asked him these questions. The story goes that the Rogachover answered each question instantaneously on the spot. And afterwards he's reported to have said, good Bochrim. See, the standard is improved in the yeshivas. So those were the options. But it's essential, even of course the gentle teacher obviously has to find a way to show the student to show him his deficiency and to show him where he needs to grow. So what have we begun to look at this evening? Actually, we've just begun the subject, because the next area in this subject is the understanding of how a Rebbe is like a father, and the intimacy of the Rebbe-Talmid relationship, and how that reflects the parent-child relationship. And we'll have to go into that next time. But what we began to discuss this evening and study is that we're looking at an essential relationship. We're looking at a relationship where there's an intimate bond here. The truth is, the bond extends far beyond the question of learning. There's a law the Rambam brings that you have to see your Rebbe. That means there's a personal connection here. It's far from a transfer of information. I mean, the highest level, perhaps we just finish with this for this evening. There's much more to say, but just to finish with this, is that the real area of learning from a Rebbe is what's called shimush. Shimush means actually serving him. That means being personally close and serving him. It means acting, as it were, as a slave, in the most intimate way. That means to be with him and to see him in all circumstances and to actually serve. It's not a question of. I mean, the Gemara brings the most stupendously difficult things to understand. It talks about one Talmud, for example, who followed his Rebbe into the bathroom. To the bathroom. Turned around and he said to him, what are you doing? He said, it's Torah, I have to learn. There's a story in the Talmud about one who hid under his Rebbe's bed. His bed, hid under his bed. He said, what are you doing here? He said, it's Torah, I have to learn. That means you have to be on the level. There's no playing games. You have to be on the level. But that means there's a serving, and through many generations, what young boys did, was that they lived in the house. They lived in the house with the Rebbe. They covered his feet at night. They washed his hands in the morning. The Gemara even reports a story of Rabbi Akiva who was on his way to learn. It's lengthy, but Rabbi Akiva was on his way to learn from his great teachers, Rabbi Shur and Rabbi Eliezer, the great leaders, lights of the previous generation. And he stopped and he was late because he found a meis mitzvah. A meis mitzvah means a person dead with no one to bury him. That takes precedence over virtually all else in the Torah. I mean, a meis mitzvah is one of the most pressing mitzvahs that there are. Somebody needs to be buried, there's no one else to do it. Rabbi Akiva spent a long time making an effort, taking the person to an appropriate place, and he buried him. When he finally got late to the yeshiva, they said to him, as if with every step you did that, you spilled blood. Because you took long and you took him to where you didn't bury him on the day, you took him, so whatever it was, you took a time, Rabbi Akiva said. But I mean, he did the mitzvah. Yeah, there's the principle in the Talmud, if a mitzvah comes to your hand, you're obliged in that mitzvah. So he was late for learning that day. It's a very difficult idea. What was the criticism? And some of the sources say the reason was because had he been on his way to learn Torah from his teachers, he would have been justified. But since he was in a position of being mashamish them, that means he was not just learning, he was serving them. That means the intimacy of relationship with them. That is so superior that it could even theoretically, to a certain extent, in a certain way, take precedence over this other. In other words, that this connection with the Rebbe, seeing him, seeing the nuances of his movement, the Talmud says you can see how great a man is by the way he walks. And therefore to actually see that, and to be present and to see the way he walks, and to see the nuances of... You know what the Hasidim say? Maybe we'll finish with this. You know the Hasidim have a custom called a tish. The tish literally means a table. But you know the Hasidic custom, on Leil Shabbos and Friday night, other occasions, the Hasidim go to the tish where the Rebbe sits, and there are various customs. In one set of customs, the Rebbe eats, and he gives out shiraim. Some of the food that he's eaten, and it's passed around in every... in some cases, the Rebbe eats and the Hasidim eat. In some cases, the custom is they don't eat at all. They explicitly do not eat. They sit there and watch him eat. And their words of Torah and so forth and so on. Do you know what the beauty of this custom is? Do you know what the real meaning is? What's the meaning of a custom to go to the Rebbe's table and to sit there and watch him break bread and eat? And the answer is this: to go to the presence of a great man and hear him teach Torah, incredible Torah, that's incredibly uplifting, is to be expected. That he should teach Torah and look like an angel is to be expected. But that he should eat food like a horse eats and look like an angel, that's something to learn. Yeah, to hear the man say uplifting things that are spiritually amazing, that's why he is who he is. But there's more you can learn, perhaps even greater in a way. To watch him do a physical action that he has in common with the biological and animal world, and to see that he does that and looks as great as when he's teaching Torah, that's a remarkable thing to learn. Yeah, that's a thing you can't, no words to say. There are no words for that. There are no words for that. It's a great tragedy that in our generation we lack so many of them. We have so few of those teachers, and they are so distant, and most people don't even know about it. And it's absolutely essential piece of one's development. You have to make the effort. You have to travel. You have to go to those people. You have to utilize opportunities in the local community. You have to travel abroad also to see those people we have who are still on the level, particularly people from the old generation, particularly those who achieved greatness before the war, those who are left. Because a different generation, a completely different standard, a completely different world. Just to look into the man's face and see the world that he has within. Those faces themselves, just if you have any sensitivity, the faces themselves speak of the content. Can I finish with a story? You have time for a story? About teachers, their faces. I heard this from one of the Torah leaders of this generation also, as it happens. Happens to be a dayan in this city, as it happens. Amazing story, almost on the verge of the unbelievable. When the Chazon Ish was alive in Israel, Chazon Ish died in 1953. So you're talking about a few years between the founding of the state and when he was nifter. the following amazing incident occurred. There was a small village, a small moshav, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, where they had in those days a mixed population. They had a population of some of the individuals were observant, dati, and some were what you call chiloni, secular. You probably know that in Israel there's a, how should I delicately say this, there's somewhat of a tension between those two elements of the population, right? Often, unfortunately, a polarization. This community consisted of both groups, and they were starting a school for the young children. Again, talking about the youngest age, little children coming to learn, and there weren't enough people in the community to have two separate schools. So you can imagine the problem. They all got together, the parents, the teachers, to discuss how are they going to run their school. The religious element wanted the school to be run on religious lines, and the chiloni element, the secular element of Israeli society, they wanted the school to be run on secular lines. But there weren't enough people and resources to start two schools. Okay? So what they did was this. They finally arrived at a compromise. And I'm telling you a true story, amazing thing. They finally arrived at a compromise where they agreed that they would have the principal, the menahel, the headmaster, the principal, would be religious, but all the teachers would be secular. Or possibly, the headmaster would be a secular individual, the principal, and the teachers would all be religious. They all felt that one of those would be a reasonable system of checks and balances, but they couldn't agree which one. And the meeting closed with the inability to decide, should we have a menahel, a principal who is religious, and teachers secular, or vice versa? The meeting agreed they would ask the Chazon Ish. Even the secular Jews, the Chazon Ish was beyond all description in terms of his greatness, and even the non-religious element in Israel certainly knew of his greatness. They decided to dispatch one of the men from the religious camp to go and ask the Chazon Ish, which way should they run their, imagine such a question, which way should they run their school? The principal should be from one year religious and the teachers not, or vice versa, and they all agreed whichever version the Chazon Ish said they would all abide by. Now listen carefully. The man went off to the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak, and he asked him, he put the dilemma to him, and he asked him which way should we do it. The Chazon Ish said, go back and tell the teachers, tell the committee, listen carefully, he said, go back and tell them they can appoint whomever they want for a principal and the teachers. All you want is the right to put up the pictures on the walls. And he gave him a certain amount of money, and he said, go to a certain shop in Bnei Brak. This man went off to that shop where they sell photographs of the Gedolim, the great Torah minds, whose faces have been captured in photography since long as photography has been around. You should see those pictures. And it's worth having a collection of just to ponder the faces, right? You can see clearly people of a different, you can see faces of incredible, tremendous sense of, etched with sense of responsibility and depth of suffering and suffering of the Jewish people, and yet a complete serenity on the face at the same time. Remarkable thing, it shines out. It's clearly visible, even in the photographs. So the man went to this place and he told the shopkeeper that this money came from the Chazon Ish. When he heard the money came directly from the Chazon Ish, he filled up a sack of these photographs. The man came back to the school, and the next committee meeting, right, and he's dealing with people who were teachers, professional teachers. They understood very well. He put the photographs on the table and he said, the Chazon Ish said you can appoint the principal and the teachers, we just want to put up these pictures on the walls. They started two separate schools. Okay? You understand that? That means these teachers understood that if this is what we look up to, can you imagine teaching in a school, okay? Whoever we are as teachers, this is what we look up to, and those particular faces. That has an indelible effect. Understand? It's remarkable. Anyway, what we learned this evening is that we need to do some of that. Right? We need to do some of that looking up to the pictures on the walls. Yeah. The pictures on the walls are not adequate, but we start there. And we move to an intimate relationship right with the Rebbe. At least one who's greater than oneself. One has to graduate beyond that. There's a principle that the Rebbe will be sent, the teacher will be sent. If you really desire it and you really need it and you know you can't move without him, he'll be sent. Just like the Arizal came up to Tzfas and he found Chaim Vital there, waiting. He'll be sent. Yeah, this is not a game. If you need it, will be given to you. Not expected to. He's the one who's orchestrating the show. He doesn't expect you to play your music without the instrument. Yeah, it doesn't expect you to do your job without the correct instruction, and he will provide it. But the desire has to be intense. It has to be a burning desire. And if it is, it will be given. I will stop there for this.